learn about Dr. Goodall.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kate Brandt. I am Google's Chief Sustainability Officer, and I am excited to be here as part of this wonderful programming called I Am Remarkable Week, which is a digital experience featuring virtual talks, thought-provoking panels, and online workshops about confidence boosting. And we have been here from September 8th through September 15th with this programming. And hashtag I'm Remarkable is a Google initiative, which is really striving to empower everyone, particularly women and underrepresented groups, to celebrate their achievements in the workplace and beyond. So I know so many of you are already aware of Dr. Jane Goodall's extraordinarily and truly remarkable career and journey, which would take truly many, many sessions like this to fully uncover and discuss. But here's my attempt at a brief snapshot. Dr. Goodall is possibly the most celebrated conservationist on the planet. I am so pleased and excited to have the honor of introducing the world-renowned and conservationist Dr. Jane Goodall. 60 years ago, Jane first set foot onto the shores of what is today Tanzania's Gombe National Park to begin the pioneering chimpanzee behavioral study. In the last 6 decades, this research has truly transformed scientific perception on the relationship between humans and animals. And with this mission evolving into a quest to empower others to make the world a better place for all living things. There is so much that I am looking forward to covering, but first I'm going to start with a short video about how the journey started.
In 1960, a young British woman ventured into the forests of Africa to follow her childhood dream, to find a way to watch free wild animals living their own undisturbed lives. She left everything familiar behind and ended up giving the world a remarkable window into our closest living relatives. She was me. I wanted to come as close to understanding animals as I possibly could. We are continuing our research at Gombe. It's the longest running study of any non-human animal, and we're using some exciting new technology to learn more about chimpanzee ranging patterns and the state of the forest. And this helps to inform decision makers on action to be taken to protect chimpanzees, their habitats, and the other creatures that live there. I flew in a small plane over Gombe National Park, and I was absolutely horrified at what I saw. So quickly, it seemed, the environment outside the national park had been utterly destroyed. The trees had gone. The land was over-farmed and infertile. They were struggling to survive. And that's when I realized that unless we helped the people to improve their lives, there was no way we could even try to save the precious chimpanzees. This was when we started Take Care, or Takari, our community-centered conservation project. Everywhere I went, I met young people who seemed to have lost hope. They all said more or less the same thing. We feel like this because we think you've compromised our future. And so that led into our program for youth, Roots and Shoots. The main message of Roots and Shoots is that every one of us makes a difference every single day. The program has now become a movement that's in 100 countries around the world. One of the things that the Jane Goodall Institute does that I feel is really most important is to try and give people hope, to help people understand that every single day we live, we can make a difference. And together, with everybody making a difference, we can change the world.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction. Dr. Goodall, it is my great honor to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. And it's lovely for me to be with you.
So there's so much ground to cover in a short period of time, but I wanted to begin, as we saw in the video, with the early part of your career and just hear you speak a little bit more about, what drove you on this journey to Africa to research chimpanzees. Where did this passion come from?
Well, the thing is that I was actually born loving animals. My mother tells me that, even when I was 1.5, I was intently studying earthworms. And luckily, I had a very supportive mother. Back then, when I was growing up, television hadn't been invented. So I learned by being out in nature and from books. Books were very important. And it was when I was 10 years old, I found this little secondhand book. We had very little money. It was World War II. Anyway, it was called Tarzan of the Apes. Of course, I fell in love with that passionately in love with that glorious Lord of the Jungle. I was very jealous because he married the wrong Jane. Of course, I knew Tarzan didn't exist, but that's what started my dream. I'm going to grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them. No thought of being a scientist. Girls didn't have those aspirations back then. And everybody laughed at me. How would you get there? Don't have money. You're just a girl. Except Mum. And she said, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity. And if you don't give up, maybe you find a way. So that was the support I had. And eventually the opportunity came, an invitation from a school friend to have a holiday in Kenya. That's where I met the late Dr. Louis Leakey. And amazingly, he gave me this opportunity to go and study not just any animal, but the one most like us. So that all began in 1960. And it was the first time anybody had studied chimpanzees in the wild. So there was no protocol. And I was able to just watch the chimpanzees the way I watched the squirrels and birds in my garden out here in Bournemouth, where I grew up, and from where I'm speaking to you now.
Wow, that's incredible. And, I would just love to hear a little bit more. What was that like? You were, I think, 23 years old. You were in a foreign land. I know, there were a few other women who also joined you in this research as part of Dr. Leakey's team. But, what was that like? You mentioned your mother was a support system for you. Who else supported you? How did you begin? What was it like?
Well, how I began was with difficulty, because first of all, Lewis found it very difficult to find money. I mean, I'd not been to college. I was a young girl, and nobody thought that this could come to any good. But finally, he got money for 6 months. Second problem, the British authorities, because back then, what's Tanzania today was Tanganyika, was one of the last outposts of the crumbling British Empire. And they said, no, we're not going to take responsibility for this young girl out in the forest. It's ridiculous. But Leakey never gave up. So in the end, they said, all right, but she cannot come alone. So who volunteered to come for 4 of the 6 months for which I had money was that same amazing mother. So she and I arrived on our own, and she kept camp and set up a little clinic. So right from the beginning, had really good relations with the local people, the fishermen along the beach of Lake Tanganyika. While I was up in the hills, first I was made to go with somebody, but then they decided, oh, well, she's okay. And so I could do what I always wanted to do, be alone and try and get the chimpanzees' trust. And that was the problem. For 4 months of the 6 months I had, they saw me and disappeared into the forest. that was a bad time.
Yes. Wow. Well, that's so amazing to hear, that support system that you had. And so, you had that initial 4 months, but then I know there was a bit of a breakthrough and you really had this experience of crossing the boundary into the chimp world. What would you highlight as some of the biggest learnings, especially at that time, when you did have that breakthrough?
Well, it was David Greybeard, a very handsome male, for some reason was less afraid than the others. And gradually I could get closer and closer to him. And then in a way, he helped me to meet the others in the community, because if he was part of a group, the others ready to run, but David would be sitting there. And so I suppose they thought, well, she can't be so dangerous after all. And the big breakthrough was when I saw him using and making tools to fish for termites. Because at that time, science thought humans and only humans used and made tools. In fact, it was very reductionist thinking back then, which I didn't know about when I went to Gombe. I knew nothing about science. And yet when I was sent to Cambridge after 2 years with the chimps by Leakey, because he told me I had to get a degree and there was no time for a BA. So I went for a PhD, and I was told, you can't talk about chimpanzee personality, mind, or emotion, because those are unique to us. But I'd learned from my childhood teacher that that was not true. And that childhood teacher was my dog, Rusty. I think don't you, that if you share your life with an animal, you know perfectly well they have personalities and minds and emotions.
Oh, absolutely. I have the same experience with my dog.
Yeah, you would. And I don't
Yeah.
think the scientists believed it, but in science, you've got to be able to prove everything. And although now we have managed to prove that animals are sentient beings, back then those ideas were pushed under the carpet because they couldn't be proved. Therefore, you couldn't mention them. But luckily, I hadn't been through that training, so I just went ahead and carried on describing what I saw. And eventually, because chimpanzees are so like us in so many ways, science gradually changed its attitude and admitted that we humans are not the only beings with personality, mind, and feelings.
Yeah. And I know, you've taught the scientific community, all of us, so much about chimpanzees, but I'd imagine you've also learned a lot from the chimpanzees. What would you say that they've taught you?
Well, they've taught many people that animals are way more intelligent than we used to think. But they didn't teach me that because I knew it already, I all my childhood. But I think the most important thing I learned from them was that, like us, they are, but we're different. And so you can stand back from this closest living relative and say, well, what's the main difference? And the main difference is the fact that we have developed this extraordinarily sophisticated intellect. And although animals are way more intelligent than people used to think, they can't compete with somebody who designs a rocket to go up to Mars with a robot to take photographs. And this is what's so strange and bizarre, that the most intellectual creature ever to walk this planet is destroying its only home, fast and faster. I mean, it seems there's a disconnect between the clever brain and the human heart, love and compassion. And, we're asking questions like, how will this decision benefit me now, the next shareholders meeting? Not how will this decision affect future generations? That's a sign of wisdom.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's been so powerful about your work and your journey of starting with the chimpanzees, all the amazing research, but then thinking about the ecosystem that needs to support them, that needs to support all of us. And we saw just a brief description in the opening video about your work on roots and shoots, how that you've brought in younger generations to really appreciate and be a part of this work of protection. I would love to hear you talk more about, this program, why you founded it, what the impact has been to date.
Well, it was in 1986 that I left Gombe. The study carries on with students because I realized how fast chimpanzees were vanishing across Africa along with forests. So I began traveling around talking about these problems and went to Africa to learn about it and realized that the people were facing terrible problems too. Lack of good education and health, degraded land, crippling poverty, and flying over Gombe and seeing the devastation with more people living there than the land could support. And that's when we began the program mentioned in that little video, Takari. And it's worked so well. That program is now in 104 villages throughout Chimp Range in Tanzania. And the people understand that protecting the environment and the forest isn't just for wildlife, it's for their future. So they become our partners in conservation. It's a lot of work, raising the money. And what's the point of doing that if new generations aren't learning to be better stewards than we've been? So the Roots and Shoots program began as I was traveling the world and meeting all these young people who'd lost hope, and they were angry or really sort of desperate. And some of them were most of them, I would say, just didn't seem to care, apathetic. And so when I began talking to them, they all said, well, you've compromised our future and there's nothing we can do about it. So, give up. Well, indeed, we have compromised their future. We've been stealing it for years and years and years. But it's not too late. I'm not the only scientist to believe we've got a window of time when, if we get together, we can start healing some of the harm we've inflicted, slowing down climate change and loss of species. And so Roots and Shoots began with 12 high school students in my home in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And we decided that the main message would be every single one of us makes an impact on the planet every day, and we have a choice what sort of impact do we make. And that every group would choose 3 projects to make the world better, because I learned in the rainforest how everything is interconnected. And so each group chooses a project to help people, a project to help animals, a project to help the environment. And these young people now, it's actually 65 countries today, and they're changing the world as we speak. I mean, there's hundreds and thousands of young people. And the great news is that what I call the alumni, because beginning in 91, some of those students are now all grown up and out in the big wide world, and some of them have decision-making jobs, and they take their values with them that they learned in Roots and Shoots. There's your dog.
There's my dog.
Yes, he's joining in. And so the alumni, as I say, they hang on to these values, and the value basically is respect for each other, respect for animals, respect for the environment.
Absolutely. And I know hope is a big theme, which is so needed today, and such an amazing theme in your journey and your message to all of us. In this Roots and Shoots program, you've talked about, the sense of younger generations being discouraged, feeling, hopeless. And I know so much of your message is about individual action and the ability of individuals to make a difference. For people who are watching this conversation, do you have any advice for encouraging them? How do you suggest people begin if they're coming from a place of sort of concern and desolation? How do we begin the journey to hope? What kind of actions, can we take?
Well, I think a major problem is people are told, think globally, act locally. But if you think globally, you do get depressed. I mean, we're bombarded every single day in the press, in the media of all sorts, about all the things going wrong. And we need to know that, absolutely. But as I've been traveling around, I meet so many amazing people doing amazing things, and places we destroyed, once again, nature can come back if we give it time. And so what do I say to people? Don't think globally first, think locally. Think, what can I do here? Maybe I can get together with a group of friends and clear the street of litter, or we can get together and put recycling bins in the school, or we can insist on buying organic food. Does it cost a bit more? Yes, but then you value it more and you waste less, because waste is a huge problem. But anyway, whatever you decide to do, it could be writing letters to legislators, it could be anything. Then you find that you do make a difference. And that gives you hope. And that encourages you to make a bigger difference. And hope is contagious. So by doing that, you're inspiring more people to take action, which gives them hope. And so that's what I tell people to do. Think of a problem that you care about and act on it, no matter how small. Billions of small ethical choices. What do we buy? Ask questions. Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals like factory farms? Is it cheap because of unfair wages? And if the answer to those is yes, don't buy it. And that consumer pressure is forcing some corporations to actually change the way they operate.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I think hope is contagious, and your hope is contagious. So we so appreciate your being the pebble in the pond of spreading that hope. So I know, of course, another important step in your journey is, the founding of the Jane Goodall organization, and that this has been, a big focus for you and your team. And just a few highlights that I read about, 290 chimpanzees and gorillas receiving care, 3.4 million acres of habitat is covered under conservation plans, and that to date you've managed to help 600 girls to return to school. Amazing work, clearly. How do you see the future of the Institute, and what projects are you most proud of?
Well, we've now got, it's either 24 or 34, I keep meaning to find out, Jane Goodall Institutes in, let's say for the moment, 24 countries. And even during the pandemic, while I've been here, grounded as I call it, we've started a new institute in India, which is fantastic, and another one in Turkey, and close to founding one in Israel. We've got new Roots and Shoots groups popping up all over the place. And so the future, well, I always say, if you aim for the stars, you might reach the moon. If you aim for the moon, you might get to the top of Everest. So I like aiming for the stars. I aim to create a critical mass of young people who understand that we all need some money to live. It's when we live for money that it starts going wrong. Unless we're living for money to help make the world a better place, in which case it's wonderful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I know you've traveled so much. I think I've heard you say maybe 300 days a year you were traveling, before this grounding. Are there just a couple examples that you would highlight of projects or people, along the way with your journey, either through the Institute or through Roots and Shoots, that stay with you as being especially inspiring?
Oh gosh, there's so many. How do I pick? I mean, I'll tell you a very symbolic story from Roots and Shoots. And that was the first group to start in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, where there's all that fighting because it's mineral rich where we are in Goma. It's on the east. And so this first group of children, they were about 10 to 12, and they'd learned at school about a hill. They could see it, but quite far, further than they thought, which had been a sacred hill covered in trees, and now the trees had gone. So they wanted to put the trees back. Well, their mentor thought, well, they can't do that, but he didn't want to squash their enthusiasm. So he got a forester to donate some saplings. Then he had to go to the colonel of the militia that was in the area at the time. It keeps changing, there's fighting going on. And this man said, well, it's a stupid idea, but I suppose there's no harm in it. But I'm going to have to send soldiers with you. So now you imagine there's 15 little children clutching their little saplings, and I suppose a shovel or something, and 4 great big Congolese soldiers with AK-47 over their shoulder. And they get to the hill and they're tired and the ground is hard, but they start trying to plant their tree. And a little girl starts to cry. Within 10 minutes, one of the soldiers leaned his gun on a tree and went to help her. And within the next 15 minutes, all the soldiers had laid aside their guns and were helping the children plant trees. And this to me is so symbolic.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah. And I mean, I've got so many stories. A little boy in the Bronx, because I was very keen to see if Roots and Shoots started, not only in the international schools, but also in inner city. And so I went to visit this school in the Bronx and gave them a talk about chimpanzees. And I didn't think it would make much difference. There were people parading up and down the aisles, apparently looking for knives. Be guns today, wouldn't it? But knives. And then a year later, I was invited back. And the head teacher said, you know, I really want you to see the difference that you made. So there were 4 presentations. And the teacher, the Roots and Shoots teacher, she was actually with tears. She said, I know, Dr. Goodall, you've seen more sophisticated presentations, but these children have never presented anything. And so they gave 3 presentations. And then the last one was 2 children, a little boy of, I think he was 11, Travis. And he'd always sat at the back of the class before. And he'd never spoken, and mostly he played truant. He wasn't even there. And he always had his hood on, because they all had older brothers, sisters, parents who were, you know, in gangs. And now Travis stood up very straight in front of me, no hood, and he said, Dr. Goodall, when you gave that talk, you showed us a picture of a chimpanzee dressed up in clothes, and you said that wasn't respectful. And then I saw a chimpanzee dressed up in clothes on a cereal packet. And they said, oh, he's very happy and loves it. And he had this grin on his face. And he said, you told us that that was not happiness, that was fear. So I wrote to you. And you said, yes, Travis, you're right. That's when I decided to take action. So he wrote to the cereal company. Of course, there were other people writing, but he didn't know that. And he got a letter saying, thank you, Mr. Travis. And the picture was removed. So think what that did to that child.
Wow.
That's what I love about Roots and Shoots. It's empowering children. It's you know, there were a group of untouchable kids who began to cry when I talked to them. And I said to the translator, why are they crying? And he said, but nobody's ever told them before that they matter.
Wow. That's so powerful and so amazing to be doing this work. I think you said in over 100 countries, right? So that you're working with children in very different settings, you know, in a rural setting and an inner city setting. But it sounds like there's been such common themes of this message of empowerment, of individual action. So I think that's really powerful to hear.
Yes, and you know, our scholarships to keep girls in school, it's partly because as women's education improves all over the world, family size tends to drop. And although people don't like talking about it, there's 7-point-something billion of us on the planet today, and already we're using up finite natural resources in some places faster than nature can replenish them. And they predict closer to 10 billion by 2050. So if we carry on with business as usual, if big companies continue exploiting the natural resources that are finite, if governments continue to believe that annual growth of GDP is more important than protecting the environment for the future, then what will it be like in 2050? And I think COVID has taught us we need a new relationship with the natural world and animals.
Absolutely. And I think, we heard so many powerful stories, right? Particularly at the beginning of COVID in true lockdown of, in cities hearing songbirds for the first time in many years or being able to see the Himalayas. Are there any stories from your journey or that people have shared with you about sort of that reconnection to nature that happened in that very unique time that stick out for you?
Well, no, I think it's a collection. I think people are waking up. There's far more awareness now. And, one of the things that has to go is intensive animal farming, these factory farms, as people eat more and more meat. And it's not just the horrible cruelty, which is terrible, but it's also the devastating effect on the environment because all of these billions of animals have to be fed. Huge areas of land are cleared to grow grain. More grain is grown to feed animals and to make biofuel than is grown to feed starving people. And there's so much hunger around the world. And then fossil fuel, the huge, great machines getting the grain to the animals to the abattoir, and the meat to the table. And then water, so scarce in some places because of climate change. And lots of water is needed to change vegetable to animal protein. And finally, they're all creating methane gas and their digestion. And that's one of the real powerful greenhouse gases. The most powerful, or the most frequent, or the most plentiful, is carbon dioxide, which comes from our reckless burning of fossil fuel. So we've got to move away from fossil fuel to sustainable, renewable, green energy. We've got to stop this massive meat eating. We've got to ban factory farms. And it's happening. That's the great thing. Vegetarianism is spreading all over the world. I mean, I became a vegetarian back in the late 60s when I read Peter Singer's book about factory farms. I knew nothing about them. We hadn't got them in England at the time. And the next bit of meat on my plate, I looked at it and I thought, this symbolizes fear, pain, death. I don't want to eat that. And that's when I became a vegetarian. Now I try to be a vegan because of the horrible cruelty to the laying hens and the capons and the milk cows. So, but it's spreading all over the world. It's growing fast. Not just vegetarianism, but veganism too, all across China. I just opened a new big organization in China that promoted veganism. So, people are waking up. That's the great thing. And we know the sort of things we need to do. We need to go to different kind of agriculture. We need to go away from these industrial way of growing our crops with these monocultures and using pesticides and herbicides and poisoning the land, the soil, the birds, the insects, and ourselves, by the way. And we need to go back to small-scale family farming and regenerative farming and permaculture and agroforestry and all those things that we used to do. And we also need to listen to the voices of the indigenous people who've been protecting their forests and fighting the commercialism which goes in with mining and logging and destroying the environment. Brave, brave people. And I meet all around the world, people who are doing amazing things, credible projects, rescuing environments, rescuing animals from the brink of extinction. So there's a lot of things, and if media would give more time to the good things that are happening, equal time with the bad.
Absolutely. And I think that's, of course, such an amazing element of I know one of your projects right now, the Hope Cast, which I'm a big fan of. And, I know we were talking before we came on camera, about, of course, how much traveling you had done before the pandemic, but now that the Hope Cast is, I think, reaching 130 countries a month, and maybe that number's even stale. But I'd love for you to just talk more about, how you ended up starting the podcast, what the first season was like, and maybe tell us a little bit about the upcoming season that I know is coming soon.
Well, when I was first grounded here I was extremely frustrated and angry because I had to cancel lectures. The venues themselves closed, but initially, everybody decided, well, Jane, there's no point going because of the pandemic. So I was frustrated. Then I thought, well, that's useless. I mean, no point. So with a little team from the Jane Goodall Institute, particularly Mary Lewis, who's right here in the UK, and Dan DuPont in America, who's the director of communications, we created Virtual Jane. And one of the things that Dan thought of was this podcast called a Hopecast. And I was very nervous. I mean, I don't mind answering questions. I don't mind something like we're doing now. But being a host and introducing, I was extremely nervous. But, I sort of, well, if you're going to do something, my mother said, give it all you've got. So I overcame my nervousness. And I've got to speak to such amazing and wonderful people. So that's been a learning curve for me too. I've learned so much from these extraordinary people. And I'm delighted that it's become such a popular podcast.
Yes, no, I think we all love having virtual Jane via this medium, and also getting to meet all of your remarkable guests. And maybe for folks who haven't listened to the podcast yet, are there a couple of guests from the first season that you would highlight that you felt like were particularly interesting conversations or things you learned that surprised you?
Well, one of the ones I really loved was talking to what's his name? My octopus teacher, Craig Foster. And I'd had a wonderful time talking to Craig Foster about the undersea world. And, we've become close email friends now, really close. So that was lovely. And I love talking to Lisa Jackson of Apple. I love talking to Azadine Downs of International Fund for Animal Welfare. I think all of them have been fantastic, all of the conversations.
Yeah, no, certainly. And then you've introduced this idea of the mailbag, right? That's also been a part of
the mailbag, yeah. Well, again, it wasn't me, it's not my field, but I've entered into it, and it means that certain people can ask questions and somebody presents the little mailbag program, and people seem to love it. I just wish we could get through more questions.
Yeah. Are there any questions that have surprised you? Are they different than the kind of questions you get when you're speaking with live audiences, or is it really similar themes to what you've seen?
It's about the same. It's very, very similar. Yeah. I think I've been asked just about every question it's possible to ask.
I can imagine. And I know another upcoming project for you is your book, The Book of Hope, A Survival Guide for Trying Times. Tell us more about the book.
Well, when it was proposed to me, I said no, because I was, I was too busy. I didn't have time to write another book. And, I've done a lot of books, and I thought, well, that's it for now. But I was told, oh, well, it wouldn't be much work. There'll be somebody interviewing you, Doug Abrams, who did the Book of Joy, and he'll transcribe it all. That's all you have to do is read it. Well, of course, it wasn't like that. And unfortunately, I can't have people writing for me. I just have to, if it's going to be something with my name on it, I've got to write it myself. And so it was actually a hell of a lot of work. But I think it's in the end come out really, really well. I think it will be very helpful to people. It's had extraordinary reviews from pre-publication copies that were sent out. I mean, just about every major reviewer has given it like top marks. So that's very encouraging.
That's wonderful. I very much am looking forward to reading it. And of course, our whole theme for today has been hope, and I think I know the answer to this question. But what continues to give you hope about humans and about conservation and all the work that we still have ahead of us? What keeps you going?
Well, first of all, it's the young people, because as you and I are speaking now, around the world somewhere there'll be young people taking action, planting trees, growing organic food, raising money to help uh, victims of war or hurricanes, doing something, volunteering in soup kitchens or in animal shelters. They choose their own projects. That's the whole point. And I think because they choose their projects, they're passionate. It's all about getting together, working out what to do, and then rolling up the sleeves and getting out and taking action.
Yeah.
And so young people, yes, they give me so much hope. And then this intellect, we're beginning to come up with all these amazing ways of creating energy out of renewables like the sun and the wind. And there's one project which has designed a machine which sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. And there are other people working on ways of controlling pests without these chemical pesticides. They're beginning to work, a program called ProVV. It's fantastic. There's people working on ways of conducting medical research and testing without the use of live animals, which is causing so much cruelty. And so our brain is beginning to work in the right way to solve the problems we've created. And then there's the resilience of nature. Like I talked about Gombe earlier in our Takari program. If you fly over Gombe now, there's no bare hills anymore. The trees have come back. And places that were totally destroyed, given time and maybe some help. And a lot described in this book of hope, just amazing. And animals on the brink of extinction can be given another chance and have been given another chance. And then finally, which I've also touched upon, is this indomitable spirit of people who tackle what seems impossible and simply won't give up. And when people say, do you really have hope? I do. And I think one of the reasons, and it's really only since working on this book that it's hit me how important this is in my life. Living through World War II, when for so long Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany, with its army, its air force, its navy. And Britain wasn't prepared because Chamberlain wanted peace. But for Churchill, Nazis would have overrun the whole of Europe. And as it was for, I think, about a year, Britain stood alone, and all the rest of Europe had either been defeated or had capitulated. And then Churchill managed to bring America into the war. And, but for so long it seemed hopeless. And I was only a child, but it was Churchill who, with his amazing speeches, he sort of raised up in people this spirit of we will not be defeated. And one thing I love, he gave his famous speech about we will fight them on the beaches, we will fight them in the lanes, we will fight them in the cities, we will fight them with everything we've got. And he mutters an aside to a friend and said, we'll fight them with the butt ends of broken bottles because that's bloody well all we've got. So, I think that made a big impression because there wasn't any, there shouldn't have been any hope at that time.
Yeah.
We're just small. We didn't have a prepared. And then, of course, all those young men who went out in the Battle of Britain, they went out to be killed, to be slaughtered, and they knew the risk, and yet they volunteered.
Yeah.
These stories, like after 9/11, I happened to be in New York, and the courage that some people showed. And every disaster, there are examples of human courage. So it's a spirit we all have, but sometimes it isn't called forth. There's no need for it. And, I always tell people, we've got this indomitable spirit. Let it grow, let it fly, play your part in the world. We've all got an indomitable spirit.
Absolutely. No, that power of the human spirit is a great reason for hope. And all of these wonderful examples that you've shared with us too, I certainly feel more hopeful.
Good.
Well, there are so many more things I would love to ask you, but I know that we have time for some live Q&A, and I want to give the opportunity for others from the audience to ask you some questions. So
Okay.
why don't we open it up? All right. And I think what we'll do is I will go ahead and read out the question and then turn it to you. So our first question is, feeling very lucky to be here. How can younger folks just starting out in their careers learn more and get involved with animal and environmental conservation efforts?
Well, you can join Roots and Shoots, which isn't only for children. It's preschool, university, everything in between. And now we're starting with, for example, the staff of big corporations. We've got Roots and Shoots programs in some prisons, in retirement homes, and a lot of the family groups, a mother, father, and kids have started up during the pandemic. And if you join Roots and Shoots, you'll be in touch with this family that's growing around the world of young people and older people who are filled with hope, and hope comes through taking action. And it doesn't matter what you do, what area you go into, you can still do your bit by making wise choices in your shopping, for example, every single day.
Absolutely. No, I so appreciate your message of the power of individual action and completely agree. Wonderful. All right. Well, our next question is, where and how do you find your rest? It takes hard work and grace managing the world's expectations to not fall under pressure and remain grounded.
Well, I don't think I know what rest is. And I'm honestly, since the pandemic began, I haven't had one single day without at least one interview or Zoom or video message.
Wow.
And usually there's 3 or 4. And when I say one single day, some people say, have a nice weekend. And I say, well, the week doesn't end. And I think I've always had that attitude, because people would say to me when I was at Gombe climbing up into the hills every single day, well, what about weekends? And I said, well, chimps don't have weekends, so I can't have weekends either, So rest, well, okay, every lunchtime I sit under my favorite tree that I climbed as a child. It's out there, beech tree. And I'm visited by a robin and a blackbird. And sometimes we sing to each other. I sing a little bit and they sing. Not always, but sometimes. And then in the evening, I go for 30 minutes walking around the cliff. Those are my rest.
It's beautiful. I like to do the same. I like to get outside too for my rest. I totally agree. Wonderful. All right. Well, our next question is, did you ever feel like you chose the wrong path, despite all the success and amazing work that benefits so many people more than just yourself?
Well, I can answer that with one word: no. I feel that I'm on this path for a reason, and I just have to try and do my best to follow the path that seemed to have been laid down for me.
Yeah, no, it seems that way. Wonderful. And our next question, what was your first thought when you saw a chimpanzee using a tool?
Eureka. To be honest, I wasn't particularly surprised, because I'd read a wonderful book called The Mentality of Apes. It was by an Austrian psychologist, and he was studying a captive colony of chimps on Tenerife. And he has these amazing descriptions of chimps using and making tools and everything. But all the scientists were saying, Well, that's not real because these chimps have learned from people, so they can't really do these things. And I just thought that was stupid. But anyway, but at the same time, when I saw David Graybeard using and making tools, I knew that this was going to be a real breakthrough because science believed only humans used and made tools. In fact, we were described as man the tool maker. And that's why Lewis said what was in the video at the beginning, now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans.
Yeah, and now we're even seeing it in other species too, right? Parrots are now being seen to
Oh,
be using
parrots.
tools.
Well, I mean, have you ever looked up, Googled Picasso?
I haven't,
Google,
no.
not Picasso the artist, Picasso. Everybody listening, Google it, and those three little videos will appear. And choose the one with the yellow border around it, the geographic sign, because that's the best one. And you'll be amazed. This artist Pig, her paintings are selling for $5,000.
Wow. All right, Picasso. We're going to Google Picasso after
Picasso.
this.
And then you've seen my octopus teacher. The intelligence of the
Yes. Oh,
octopus is
yes.
amazing. And they can use tools. They've been seen carrying 2 half coconut shells. They
Right.
get out to where they want to hunt, where there's no rocks to protect them. They put 1 half down. They ooze their boneless bodies into it, reach out, bring the other half over the top, and all you see are 2 eyes looking out. And a poor little fish goes by, and whoo, that's the end of the little fish. So that they've made a house.
Yeah. No, it's amazing.
And it's the best time for any students wanting to learn about animal intelligence is now, because the scientific door has opened to encourage people to study animal intelligence. And they're not denying that insects may have intelligence. So students today can study all the things which didn't exist in my day, according to science.
Yeah. No, it's a great time to be learning science.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, our next question is, where did we go wrong since the first IPCC report, meaning the UN climate report? And how have those factors shifted to bring us hope today?
Well, unfortunately, the Paris Agreement, nations came together and it was wonderful that they did, and they all made commitments to voluntarily curb their emissions. I don't think one single nation, maybe 1 or 2, actually lived up to what they promised. And those ones that said they did were because they exported their dirty industries overseas. So they didn't count those emissions that were made in India or China for the goods that they were then selling to make money. And I think what's gone wrong is that there are too many people in business and government who want business as usual. They want to go on acquiring wealth and power. And we just need not only a new relationship with the natural world, acknowledging that the natural resources are finite, but we need a new definition of success. And it shouldn't be just wealth and power. It should be, well, enough to lead a life where I can spend time in nature, time with my family, feed my family, do the things I want, have a little holiday. But to go on acquiring stuff and stuff and stuff and, get bigger and bigger and bigger, that's what's got wrong. And what do we do? Well, there is a lot more awareness. There's more people fighting for change. And if we carry on with business as usual, quite honestly, we're doomed. So we have to change. We must.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, our next question is, you've addressed population growth and advocate for education and access to birth control. Is this approach gaining traction? Politicians still appear wary of this matter.
Yeah, they've been wary of it for a long time. And I think partly at the beginning, it was called population control. And nobody wants to be controlled. You know, that's very invasive to invade your private life and tell you that you can't have lots of children. And also, it's been cultural in many, many places for women to have lots of children. And in fact, in Victorian Britain, 20 children wasn't abnormal, really and truly. So when I first began talking about population growth was back in the 70s, when Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb. And everybody said, Jane, you can't talk about this. It's just not politically correct. So I thought, okay, I talked about voluntary population optimization. Can't fault that, can you? It's voluntary and it's optimizing the population. And I've very, very seldom been called to account, because if you just present the facts are there's this number of people, we're already using up these finite natural resources faster than nature can replenish them. So if we don't change something, what's going to happen? That's something we need to think about and talk about. And is it gaining traction? Well, with our Takari program in Africa, the women were 8 to 10 children when we first went, partly because it was their culture and it gave kudos to the man if he had lots of children, partly because there was a very high infant mortality because there was no good health facility. So we've helped to build better health, especially for women and children, and provided this family planning information. Not a group of white people doing it, no, local people who learned about it in workshops, and including some men, actually. And this is what the people want, because even in the most rural communities, the people have understood that the way out of poverty is a good education for your children. And they can't afford to educate 8, 10 or more children. And so the family size, I don't know, I asked and I haven't got the answer yet, but it's 8 or 10, it's not the normal anymore. And many of the people who've been involved with family planning, 3, 4 maximum, instead of 8 or 10.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop it there and I will stop sharing my screen real quick. And just, we had a few people leave already, but just wanted to see if anyone had any thoughts on this, and I can put the link in the chat to this video in case people want to finish that last 5 minutes or so. But thank you for joining me today. Glad to see everybody. I'm also going to stop recording if I can figure out where. There we go.